Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a special summer episode of Whatstheres. While we're normally all about the ongoing conversation about the resolutions of high school debate, of course, it's summer, and we don't have any particular resolutions that we're currently working on. Of course, if you've been a regular listener, you know that we at Thales are getting ready for the Coolidge Cup tournament, but it's going to be a couple months before we have any new resolutions. So I'm off for the summer traveling, and one of my trips has been to Clarkston, Georgia, and I've spent the last week with international refugees and their children as part of Camp Encounter here in Clarkston, Georgia. I've learned that Clarkston is referred to as, quote, the most diverse square mile in America, with refugees from literally all over the world. In the last 3 days, I've met children from South Sudan, from Eritrea, from Burma, from Israel, from literally all around the globe. Some of them are here with incredibly tragic stories. Some of them are here for reasons that they may or may not be able to articulate. But all of them are from somewhere else, and they're now settled here in Clarkston, Georgia. And as part of that, I've also gotten to meet Josh Davis, the executive director of an organization called Proskuneo. And he's got a very interesting take on international refugees, and they're a big part of his ministry. So on this episode, we're going to be discussing his work and his organization and what exactly we ought to know about international refugees and what that has to do with the church. Josh, welcome to What's the Res?
Thank you so much. Glad to be with you.
So help us with this funny word. I suspect most of our listeners don't know Greek. They probably don't know proskuneo. So help us with what that is exactly.
Exactly, yeah. Proskuneo is the Greek word for worship. So if you were to read the New Testament of the Bible and see the word worship in English, every time you see it in English, most likely it goes back to that Greek word proskuneo. We chose that as a title for our ministry about 18 years ago because we work with so many different people from all over the globe, primarily Christians, who are worshiping God and finding ways to worship God together. And we can go back to the New Testament and kind of have that common, uncommon ground of Greek. We didn't want our name to be in English because we work with so many different languages.
So do people from other countries, other backgrounds, would they find it to be less welcoming if your organization was named in English?
Not necessarily, but we just didn't want that kind of domination of one language over another. English can be a dominant language all throughout the world, so we try to encourage local languages, and picking something like Greek that's a little obscure is a way for us to highlight that.
Oh, that's fantastic. I, for one, have very much appreciated your leadership at Camp Encounter this week. I don't entirely know which languages we've been singing in, but I think there was a song you led us in on Monday that had at least 3, maybe 4 languages. Is that right?
Yeah, we write songs all the time here in our community that have all these different languages. Partly because people like me who grew up in one place and then moved to another place have 2 languages inside them already. Most of the refugees who live here speak at least 2 languages. Many of them speak 3, 4, 5, 6 languages. So when they come to write a song, they want to bring all of those languages with them. And so rather than saying, well, this song should be in only one language, say, why does that have to be the case? Let's write something that uses more than one language.
That's fascinating. So really the songwriting becomes a way to draw on these various parts of people's backgrounds and bring them all together.
Exactly, and allow for them to express more fully who they are, rather than to have to compartmentalize or to check part of their culture or identity at the door.
So part of your ministry then is not asking people to necessarily, well, now that you're in America, you have to somehow submit to the dominant culture, but rather helping to find ways to preserve their own culture in the midst of this new country.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really a both-and approach. We believe that it's going to be helpful to them to be able to have a good working language grasp of English, but the language that they grew up with is the language of their hearts. And so they're most likely going to be able to express their deepest emotions and their deepest ideas in their heart language. So, of course, we want to bring that into worship God, right? So we don't want somebody to always have to be translating in their head when they're worshiping God, but to just be able to speak freely and to sing freely.
That's fascinating. I know we were talking earlier, and you used the word multiculturalism in a way that struck me as very interesting. I think most of the time I hear multicultural, I hear it from someone who's usually pretty secular, and they're usually on the left end of politics, and they're wanting to create a more multicultural world is usually the phrase. And I at least when I hear that, I get pictures of kind of the flags of the world and the United Nations with all those flags lined up in a semicircle.
Sure.
What do you mean by multicultural? And is there a way in which Christianity really is a multicultural faith?
Yeah. Actually, for me, it's the picture that we see in Revelation chapter 5 and 7 that informs so much of what we do. John gets this glimpse in Revelation of people from every tribe and language and nation gathered around the throne of Jesus worshiping, right? They're all in the same place at the same time. So clearly you could call that a multicultural gathering of people. And one day as I was reading that passage in Revelation, I remembered the prayer that I had been taught to pray when I was little, that Jesus taught his disciples to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And I just realized, man, so many times here on earth, we're segregated. Even in the church, we're segregated by language and culture, where we see this glimpse in heaven of everyone together worshiping Jesus at the same time in the same place. Why couldn't that happen here on earth? And so I've spent the last 18 years of my life trying to see that happen in little and big ways.
Is that something that churches tend to naturally welcome or naturally move towards, or does it take intentional effort to kind of break out of the way we've always done things? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
I realize that's a very broad question.
Sure,
So
but
make
yeah,
of it what you will.
I think what I find most often is that churches would say, well, anyone is welcome, right? But they don't think about what message they're sending that would maybe be pushing people away. And they're not necessarily willing to make changes to the way that we've always done things in order to be welcoming to somebody whose first language is in English. Like I said before, if I don't speak English fluently and I walk into your church, everything's in English. I'm working really hard the whole hour or hour and a half that I'm sitting there, just translating everything in my head. And a lot of people just don't realize that unless you've had the experience of going to another country and sitting through a worship service in a language you don't understand. You don't realize how challenging that really is. So part of it is raising awareness. And then once a church leadership says, yeah, we're willing to try this, there's got to be some real creativity because no one's ever seen this done exactly that way before. Depending on the church's context and the languages and cultures that are around it, it's going to look different in that church than it would in a church down the road or down the next town over. So there's got to be some creativity involved. And then at the end of things, there's got to be a shared leadership and a sharing of power. And that's where I find that we have the most trouble, is when I have to give up some power so that someone else could have power as well.
That is just fascinating because you're talking about these things that, especially when we bring into issues of power. I mean, that's another term that I hear a lot, and I tend to associate with left-wing scholarship. They have a lot of concerns about feminine power or some sexual minority group gaining more power or something.
Sure.
But you're using that in a very biblical sense to really look at the way power is shared among people who are worshiping together.
Right. Yeah. And who makes the decisions and whose songs do we sing? And I mean, we have those power struggles in the church. Even among one culture, we can see power struggles between one generation and another generation, right? And some of the things that have caused what we would call the worship wars in churches are the same things that keep people from different countries and cultures out of our.
Now, is there, in your work, do you see any kind of natural drive people of one culture to want to maintain the traditional practices of their culture within the majority culture?
Yeah, it's challenging because for a lot of immigrants, they're working all day long in American culture, and church could be that one chance of the week that they could actually hear just their own language and they could be with just their own people. So it can be really challenging for someone from an immigrant background to even want to worship in a multicultural environment, because Sunday is that precious time where I can just not have to speak English for a few hours and be with people that think like I do. But when they catch a bigger glimpse of what the church is, they realize, man, we were called not to be separate but equal, but together. And there's a lot of power in that.
That's a fascinating vision. I hadn't really thought about the way that this is not just necessarily like Americans kind of changing what they're doing. It also, that's a bit of a sacrifice from folks who have I know this past Sunday I got to attend the Swahili service
Okay.
Sunday afternoon, and I resonate with you said a moment ago, that experience of having to mentally translate. They were gracious and had someone translate the sermon for
Okay.
us, but there were about an hour to maybe 2 hours worth of material where there was no translation, and
Right.
I was completely lost.
Yeah.
And it helped me be hopefully in the future, but certainly now, be a lot more sympathetic to people who are arriving. And I can very much understand the desire to be back with my people who have my shared cultural background, and I'm not always working to be understood in the majority language and culture.
Right. But unfortunately, that only works for about a generation, because once they start having children who are born here in the United States, a lot of times the kids aren't fluent in their parents' language.
I've wondered that this week.
Yeah.
I've seen so many of the children of these refugees, and their English is great.
Yeah, absolutely. It's their first language. Maybe they were even born in another country, but if they move here early enough, they pick up English as their main language. And when that's the case, then they're actually lost in their parents' worship services. So unless parents are willing at some point to say, well, we should at least be bilingual in our church, then families are fracturing and having a hard time worshiping.
So this really is necessary for churches and church leadership within that cultural group to acquire that larger vision you're describing for the survival of the community.
Right, I think it is. And then the bigger picture for me is what Jesus prayed in John chapter 17, which he prayed for all of us as believers in Jesus to be one in the same way that he's one with the Father, so that the world would know that Jesus is who he says he is. And for me, that's the biggest motivation, that we would be one across cultural and language and generational barriers, so that the world would know that.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, help us a little bit with why your focus is on music, dance. And I think you've used the term worship arts this week. Why that area? I mean, it doesn't. Or unless you're also focused on kind of interlingual preaching, and I haven't heard about that part.
Yeah.
Is that also part of Proskuneo's
We do
mission?
teach about that as well, and help preachers figure out how to not only preach in one language or from one cultural perspective, but to be broader than that. But primarily we focus on the worship arts, music, dance, visual art. Part of that is just because that's who I am. I grew up playing music since I was 4. My grandmother gave me my first violin, and I majored in music in college. So part of it is that. And then part of it is the power that we've seen in the arts to cross culture, and even to sometimes seemingly transcend culture. A lot of times your artists in a community are on the margins of the community, but they're able to affect the community even though they're on the margins. And because they're on the margins, if you were to imagine 2 circles, one circle being, let's say, American culture, and another circle right next to it being, let's say, Burmese culture.
Sure.
The artists are going to be on the margin, the edges of those circles, so the artists are actually closer to one another than the people in the core of the culture. And so we find that artists have an easier time crossing cultures and forging relationships cross culture, and then they can be bridges for the people who are more in the core of each culture. So there's some strategy to it as well.
Oh, that's fascinating. I've certainly loved watching. I think you are the only person who at least outwardly looks American that I've seen this week who is very good at dancing. All the other white guys are up there with no sense of rhythm, and I certainly count myself
At
in
least
there.
they're trying, right?
That's true.
I've loved watching it.
Oh, I got a great video of one of our pastors today trying to dance, and it was gold. I mean, it's so good. Oh, now, I've learned this week a lot about the international refugee crisis, and it's not something I knew very much about before coming. And the number I've heard is 67 million people displaced globally, and that those are for a variety of different circumstances, reasons. That's Syria, that's Somalia, that's Afghanistan, Iraq. That's a lot of places and a lot of different things. Could you give us just kind of your perspective on international refugees and just what do they go through and before they arrive here? What are some of the needs of that unique circumstance?
Yeah, I mean, just from my own vantage point, I've been here in this community, living with my family for the last 6 years, and then working
That
here in
being
this
Clarkston.
community. Yeah, for longer than that. And this community has been resettled by refugees since the early 90s. Wherever there was trauma in the world, this community would receive a wave of people from that place. And so there's a lot of stories, right? And everybody's story is individual and unique. But some of the things that I've realized, number one, my refugee friends are extremely resilient people. They've been through so much, and they've had to start their lives completely over at 25 years old or 40 years old or some 60, 70 years old.
Wow.
They're starting from scratch, right? With no relationships, with no social capital, with no money in the bank, no job skills in the new country. All of those things are starting from scratch, and they're amazingly resilient. I'm constantly challenged by that way. They've gone through a large vetting process actually to get here. A lot of people are afraid, of refugees because they don't know. First of all, they probably never met one. Second of all, they don't realize they go through a lot of vetting before they come. And so that's been something that I've realized throughout the process. It's actually very difficult for them to get out and to come here to the United States. I have a lot of friends who are refugees and they're stuck in a refugee camp. On the border of Thailand and Burma, for example, is a camp I've been to a couple of times. And they really have very little hope of ever leaving that camp. They're not allowed to be citizens in Thailand because they're from Burma originally, but the Burmese government is persecuting them as an ethnic minority. They really have no place to be or to go except for this little camp. So it's hard. It's hard for them to even get here.
That vetting process, is that run through the United Nations?
I believe so. Yeah, I'm not an expert on that, but there are a lot of steps in that process that they have to get through successfully in order to be here. And most of them have suffered deep personal loss that's been out of their control, right? Some friends of mine were born in Bhutan. They're ethnically Nepali, but the Bhutanese government, when it came to power, said anyone who's ethnically Nepali has to be out of the country by this date or we will kill you. And they had to leave. They had to leave their homes, their businesses, everything that they had worked for 10, 15, 20 years, had to leave it behind. And then they had to flee to Nepal where they weren't recognized as citizens. They weren't allowed to work. They weren't allowed to go to school. They've had deep personal loss. And so for me, one of the things we love to do is use the arts to give them a chance to work through some of that, to express some of the grief that they've been through, tell their stories in creative ways, through drawing, through painting, songwriting, and to find healing in that process.
Wow, that's kind of that's amazing. It's hard for me to fathom. I mean, I've spent the week working with the children. I know you've obviously spent plenty of time with their parents.
Yeah.
The years. It's hard for me to fathom that these kids who look like they could be really any kids anywhere,
right,
are coming out of these horrific circumstances.
Right.
I love that word resilience. That seems like a great word.
Yeah, a funny story, funny from my perspective, but also sad at the same time. So here in Clarkston, we have a Christmas celebration at the local city hall, and they set off fireworks. Some of my friends who are refugees from the Congo called me, and they said they heard bombs, and did that mean that we needed to leave the town and find a safe place? Because that was their history. Anytime there was sounds like that, they had to pick up from wherever they were, leave everything, and move on to the jungle or move to the bush or move to the next town. And so the fireworks, spurred them to think that way. And we just think, as an American, like this was a celebratory thing. But for them, it conjured up all of this history, pain, and trauma.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this then. I know I'm in a Southern Baptist church. I'd like to think that we fit Mark Dever's 9 marks of a healthy church very, very effectively as a church. But as a denomination, the Southern Baptist Church has a history of racial issues in its past, and certainly I think we've been moving in a very positive direction in recent years. But one of the ongoing issues we have as a nation is really sometimes struggling with how do we handle the geographic movement of different ethnicity. Is the kind of movement that you're describing and that you live in the midst of, is this an opportunity for churches, or is this something they should fear? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I read Acts chapter 17 very literally, where it says that God ordains the exact places where people live. And I don't think God is surprised at all by this global migration. I believe God is sovereign and somehow at work in all of this process. I do think it's an opportunity. We've spent thousands and millions of dollars sending short-term teams overseas, sending missionaries overseas to reach some of the very nations and cultures that are right here in my town. And here in my town, we don't have to worry about the government's laws that might be anti-Christian or whatever that might be. We have freedom here to be able to share freely about Jesus and what he's done for us. I do think it's a huge opportunity for the gospel, and I think it's a huge opportunity for us to learn how to love our neighbors when our neighbors don't look like us or don't think.
That's a great thought. Now, I know you mentioned your own background. Yeah. How did you get involved or interested in this kind of intercultural, multicultural kind of ministry?
Yeah. When I was 13 years old, my parents decided to become missionaries. They didn't ask me, by the way, whether that was okay with me. And I thought it was the worst thing that had ever happened, really, to leave the U.S., to leave all my friends and family, go to this place called the Dominican Republic, which I'd never even heard of and didn't know anybody there. And anyway, long story short, I actually learned so much about God and about worship in the Dominican Republic, learning under Dominican leaders and learning how to praise God in the Dominican way. I learned Spanish, speak Spanish fluently, and it became a heart language for me. And so I love to worship God that way. So then I came back to the United States and I realized, man, every Sunday I had to choose, was I going to be American when I went to worship, or was I going to be Dominican worship? Because there was no place I could be both of those in the same context, right? There was no place I knew of where I could speak both English and Spanish in the worship service. No place I could be both of those things that were inside of me. And I realized in that moment that the body of Christ was going through that kind of conflict, inner conflict on a daily basis, weekly basis, because we segregate along the lines of race. And that's really what got me into this whole thing. It was that inner conflict that I felt. Am I Dominican? Am I American? Do I really have to choose? Or has God written my story in such a way that I'm actually both? And it's good that I'm both. And that's the message I tell our kids here who mom and dad are from Sudan and they've grown up in the United States and they kind of feel like they're caught in the middle. No, you get to be both. You get to be a bridge like the Apostle Paul, who knew how to leverage both of his cultural identities when the time was right for the gospel's sake.
And neither of those cultural identities are exclusive of the other.
Right. Yeah. So many times we look at them as if they were, because we have this one is right, one is wrong mentality. Like somebody's got to be right, that means somebody's got to be wrong. But so much of culture is just different ways of looking at it. I think each culture has things that honor God, that are directly in line with God's truth, God's word. Each culture has things that are against God, that are against God's ways and his truth, his word. But then there's a lot of stuff in the middle that's like, do we have a 3-hour worship service or a 45-minute worship service? Nothing in the Bible says one way or the other. It's just a cultural.
Well, I think this is going to become an increasingly significant issue for the United States. I mean, as the global conflicts that have resulted in 67 million international refugees, those don't show any signs of stopping anytime soon. And I know for one of the normal purposes of this podcast is we discuss resolutions for the National Speech and Debate Association. One of the ones that will probably be a big deal next year is dealing with international climate refugees. As climate change occurs, assuming for whatever reason climate change, but
sure.
if climate change does in fact occur at a substantial way, millions of coastal residents whose homes will literally no longer exist. They will need somewhere to live. So I think what you presented to us today is a vital message certainly for all of Americans who hopefully have a broader perspective of international cultures, but certainly for churches to look at changing ethnic populations of their cities, not as any kind of threat, but as an amazing opportunity for the gospel right there at their doorstep.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll see it bring us closer and closer to eternity and what God has planned for us.
Hopefully so. I think one of the things I was thinking about as we discussed this a little bit this morning, it seems to me that secular multiculturalism is a very flat sort of idea, where the idea of being really multicultural means you have to almost step outside of any culture and then consider every culture to be exactly equal and respected without having any actual ownership of anyone. But the kind of cultural perspective you've been advocating really appreciates the uniquenesses of each one and appreciates the way each culture has habits and methods of worship that are of great value. And somehow we're all harmed if we flatten all of those distinctions down to Southern Gospel or the Southern Baptist hymn, something of that nature.
Yeah, there's another passage later on in Revelation that says that the kings of the earth will bring the glory of the nations into the New Jerusalem. And that's really what I picture on a Sunday morning for our churches, is how can we bring the glory and the honor, the beautiful things of each of our cultures to God in worship, and how can we honor him with what he has given to us?
A beautiful, beautiful picture. Well, where can people find you and your ministry online, and how can they support your work?
Yeah, well, you can find us online at proskuneo.org, proskuneo.org. Also find us on Facebook, Proskuneo Ministries. Find out what's going on with us there. And we're always looking for people who are willing to come and intern with us or volunteer with us. We have 7 different teams that are joining us to run camp this summer. And then there are ways to scholarship students. We've got a School of the Arts that happens here in Clarkston all year round. So there are ways to scholarship students if you want to invest in the life of some of the students that are here that we get to work with that are pretty amazing people.
And all of those are available on your website.
You can find all of that on our website.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for giving us a few minutes of your time this afternoon. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for a special episode of What's the Res? I know this is a little bit out of our normal orbit of debate commentary and pressing current political issues, but I do think this episode fits as one of our broader ways of considering important concerns and being aware of them. So if you like what you've heard this episode, please head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave us a 5-star review. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do that by sending us an email at whatstheres@gmail.com. And also check out our website, where we'll eventually have the show notes posted along with the Proskuneo link, which will also be in the show description. That website is www.whatstheres.com. If you want to follow us on Facebook or Instagram, that's at whatstheres_. You can also find us on Facebook at the What's the Res page. And if you're listening to this in the last week of June in 2019, do keep an eye out for our upcoming big announcements the first week of July. Also, I should mention, for anybody who is listening to this in the next 6 days, on June 26th, we are going to be trying out a new experiment where we're going to have a live debate over CastBox's new platform called Livecast. Be sure to follow us for the link and all the information about how you can tune in, where 2 high school students will be debating the resolution resolved. On balance, President Trump has been an effective president in his first term. So be sure to tune in at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on June 26th for that information. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and for making it through all of those random bits of information at the conclusion. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, work hard, speak well, and seek truth.